Welcome, dear listener, to another gentle tale from the village of St. Mary Mead. Pull up a chair by the fire, pour yourself a cup of Earl Grey, and allow Miss Jane Marple, knitting needles in hand and eyes sharp as ever, to untangle a puzzle that has the entire parish whispering behind lace curtains. What began as a harmless village fete has ended in tragedy, and only one elderly lady suspects it was no accident at all. Chapter 1. The Fate and the Fallen Guest. The village green of St. Mary Mead lay bathed in golden light as though the sun itself had decided to attend the fete and was showing off a little. Oaks older than the Domesday Book cast dappled shade across trestle tables laden with jam, knitted egg cozies and prize marrows so glossy they might have been polished by the WI's collective anxiety. Children darted between skirts like minnows. A hoop bowled past with a wooden clatter. Somewhere a coconut refused to yield to a shy. At the heart of the green, beneath a cedar whose branches swept the grass like a crinoline, sat Miss Jane Marple. She wore dove-gray lace mittens despite the warmth, and her knitting, a complicated lavender shawl with a blackberry stitch border, rested in her lap like a sleeping cat. A small sign beside her wicker chair read, in her own neat copper plate, "Guess the weight of the cake. 6 to go." No one had yet dared. The cake, a towering Genoa soaked in enough brandy to fell a bishop, glared at them from beneath a glass dome. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes, deceptively mild, moved across the scene with the precision of a watchmaker. She noted the way Mrs. Price Ridley's new hat tilted too far forward. Vanity? Or had she lost weight and not admitted it? She observed young Tommy Pierce, the post office delivery boy, slipping a second slice of Dundee cake beneath his cap when the stallholder's back was turned. And she saw with a small inward sigh that Colonel Arbuthnot's left hand trembled as he raised a cup of tea to his lips. Parkinson's, poor man. Or perhaps the tremor of a secret. The loudest presence on the green, however, was Mrs. Bantry, Dolores Bantry of Gossington Hall, though the hall had seen better days and the Bantry fortune with it. She presided over the Women's Institute cake stall in a hat the size of a cartwheel, its ostrich feathers quivering with every enthusiastic gesture. "2 shillings for a raisin scone, Colonel," she trilled, brandishing a plate as though it were the crown jewels. "Every penny to the Belgian Refugees Fund, and I assure you Mrs. Lestrange's recipe is lighter than thistledown." Colonel Arbuthnot, ramrod straight in a blazer 2 sizes too large for his shrunken frame, dropped coins into the OXO tin with the air of a man paying protection money. Rather give it to the regimental widows. Belgians have had their turn." Mrs. Bantry's smile froze for the briefest moment. Miss Marple caught it, the way one catches a flicker of lightning, behind cloud. Then the smile was back, wider than ever. "Nonsense, Colonel. Charity begins at the garden gate. Now do try the special scone. I had cook glaze it with extra honey for the judge." The judge in question, Sir Henry Clithering, late of Scotland Yard and currently adjudicating the marrow competition, was at that moment deep in conversation with the vicar about dry rot in the North Transept. He waved a vague hand in acknowledgement but did not approach the stall. Mrs. Bantry's feathers drooped a fraction. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. She had known Dolores Bantry since they were girls. Dolores Gale, then, with pigtails and a laugh like bells. Marriage to Arthur Bantry had been a step up, socially speaking, but Arthur's recent entanglement with the land girl from Lower Farm had set tongues wagging from the post office to the Blue Boar. Dolores was desperate to reclaim her position. A successful fete, a triumphant scone, a nod from Sir Henry, small currencies, but in St. Mary Mead they were gold. At 2:47 precisely, Miss Marple later recalled the church clock chiming the 3/4, Mr. Clarence Polk arrived. The bank manager was a man of precise habits and imprecise waistcoats. Today's choice was a loud check that clashed with the geraniums. He mopped his brow with a handkerchief the size of a tablecloth and beamed at Mrs. Bantry. "Morning, Dolores. Or afternoon, haha. Must support the cause, what? I'll take 2 scones. One for now, one for Mrs. Polk. She's partial to a raisin." Mrs. Bantry's eyes flicked to the separate plate at the back of the stall, the special scone glazed to a mahogany sheen and studded with currants that gleamed like tiny black pearls. "Of course, Clarence, though perhaps you'd like to honor us with the judge's scone. I did set it aside for someone distinguished." Mr. Polk chuckled, a sound like gravel in a bucket. "Distinguished? That'll be the day. No, plain scone for me. Watching the old waistline, you know." He patted the offending article, which responded with a muffled thud. Miss Marple watched as Mrs. Bantry hesitated, only a heartbeat, then placed the special scone on a separate paper doily and slid it across. "For Mrs. Polk, then. Tell her it's my own honey from the Hall hives." Mr. Polk paid, pocketed the second scone, and took an enthusiastic bite of the first. Crumbs rained onto his waistcoat like confetti. Light as a feather, Dolores. You'll sweep the board at the county show." Mrs. Bantry preened. The ostrich feathers lifted. The brass band struck up Rule Britannia. Children abandoned their hoops to cheer the coconut shy. Miss Hartnell, the WI treasurer, bustled past with a ledger under one arm and a face like a lemon souffle that had failed to rise. She paused to hiss at Mrs. Bantry, "We're 3 shillings short on the tombola takings. Again!" before vanishing in the direction of the bottle stall. Dr. Haydock, the village GP, strolled by with his black bag and a pipe that never seemed to stay lit. He nodded to Miss Marple. "Afternoon, Miss M. Keeping an eye on us all as usual?" "One does what one can," Miss Marple murmured, "though I fear some eyes are keener than others." The doctor chuckled and moved on, pausing to exchange a word with Colonel Arbuthnot. The colonel's tremor was more pronounced now. He spilled tea on his cuff and swore under his breath. At 3:12, though the church clock, Miss Marple would later insist, was 5 minutes slow. Mr. Polk finished his scone. He brushed crumbs from his mustache, beamed at the company, and opened his mouth to make a remark about the excellence of the butter. He never completed the sentence. A small, polite cough escaped him. Then another, less polite. His eyes widened, the pupils contracted to pinpricks. The handkerchief fluttered from his fingers and drifted to the grass like a white flag. He clutched at his throat, knuckles whitening, and took one stumbling step sideways. The checked waistcoat strained across his chest as though something inside were trying to escape. "Clarence!" Mrs. Bantry's voice rose, sharp with sudden fear. "Clarence, are you—" Mr. Polk folded. Not dramatically, he was not a dramatic man, but with the neat finality of a deck chair collapsing. His knees buckled, his arms flapped once like a startled penguin, and he subsided between the trestle tables in a heap of checkcloth and startled dignity. A plate of scones teetered, then righted itself with a clatter. For a moment the green held its breath. The band played on, oblivious. A child laughed somewhere near the hoopla. Then chaos erupted, not the screaming, tearing chaos of cities, but the restrained English version. Startled exclamations, the rustle of skirts, the thud of sensible shoes on turf. Dr. Haydock was there in seconds, kneeling beside the prone figure. He loosened the waistcoat buttons with practiced efficiency, pressed fingers to the neck, lifted an eyelid. The pipe, forgotten, rolled into the grass. "Heart," he said briskly, though his voice carried an odd note. "Too much rich food, excitement. Stand back, please, give the man air." But Miss Marple, rising slowly from her chair, knitting abandoned, had already seen what the doctor perhaps hoped no one else would. The faint bluish tinge at the lips like the bloom on a grape, the rigid curl of the fingers as though clutching an invisible rope. The faint, unmistakable scent, Bitter almonds carried on the warm air like a ghost of Christmas puddings passed. She had smelled it once before in 1923 when old Mr. Carver the chemist had demonstrated rat poison to the garden committee. "Cyanide," he had said cheerfully. "One whiff and the little beggars are dancing with the angels." Mr. Polk was not dancing. He lay very still, eyes staring at the August sky as though surprised by its blueness. Mrs. Bantry's ostrich feathers trembled violently. But he was fine. He ate the scone and said it was delicious. "Which scone?" Miss Marple's voice cut through the murmurs, quiet but clear as a bell. "The special one with the honey glaze?" Mrs. Bantry's hand flew to her throat. "Yes, no, I mean he took the judge's scone, but I told him it was for—" Sir Henry Clithering pushed through the growing circle, marrow prize forgotten. "Good God, is he—" "Dead," Dr. Haydock said flatly. He stood brushing grass from his knees. "I'll telephone the coroner, heat stroke most likely. Or coronary. We'll need a post-mortem, of course." His eyes flicked to Miss Marple, a warning. But Miss Marple was already kneeling, awkwardly, for her knees were not what they had been beside the body. She lifted the paper doily that had fallen from Mr. Polk's plate. A single currant remained, larger than the rest, its surface glossy with honey. She held it to the light. A pinprick, almost invisible, marred its perfection. "Curious," she murmured. Tommy Pierce, the delivery boy, hovered at the edge of the crowd, eyes saucer-wide. "Blimey, Miss Marple, he just dropped, like a sack of spuds." "Language, Tommy," Miss Marple said automatically, but her mind was elsewhere. She slipped the currant into her handkerchief, knotting it with care. Colonel Arbuthnot's voice boomed suddenly. "Damned shame. Good man, Palk. Steady sort. Too many scones, that's all." His hand trembled as he raised a fresh cup of tea, spilling half of it on the grass. Miss Hartnell appeared, ledger clutched like a shield. "I must count the takings. Shock or no shock, the Belgian refugees." "Later, Miss Hartnell," Sir Henry said firmly. "Constable, cordon off the stall. No one touches anything until the police surgeon arrives." The band, finally noticing the commotion, trailed into silence. A child began to cry. Somewhere a hoop rolled to a stop against a table leg. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. The lavender shawl had slipped to the ground. She retrieved it, folding it with deliberate care. Her eyes moved across the faces, Mrs. Bantry white as milk, the colonel staring into his teacup, Dr. Haydock lighting his pipe with fingers that were not quite steady, Miss Hartnell, lips moving in silent calculation, Tommy Pierce shifting from foot to foot as though the grass burned, and the scone stall suddenly sinister in its innocence. 50 identical scones, golden and blameless. One plate set a little apart, now empty save for a smear of honey and a scatter of crumbs. The church clock struck the quarter, 3:17, though Miss Marple's watch, a gift from her nephew Raymond, insisted it was 3:22. 5 minutes, a lifetime in some circumstances. She tucked the knotted handkerchief into her sleeve. "Dear me," she said softly. "What a very unfortunate accident." But her eyes, bright and steady, said something else entirely. Chapter 2. Tea at the vicarage. The vicarage garden lay in the soft afterglow of tragedy, as though the roses themselves had paused in their blooming to listen. It was 5:20, the golden hour when shadows lengthen and the air smells of warm brick and sweet William. A blackbird practiced scales from the yew hedge. Somewhere in the kitchen, Mrs. Dane Calthrop was coaxing a Victoria sponge to rise despite the shock. Miss Marple sat at the wrought iron table beneath the mulberry tree, her lavender shawl now draped across the back of a chair like a sleeping cat. Before her, the tea things were arranged with ecclesiastical precision. Crown Derby cups, a silver strainer shaped like a swan, a plate of watercress sandwiches cut into perfect triangles. The scones, baked that morning by the vicar's wife in a defiant gesture of normality, steamed gently beneath a crocheted cozy embroidered with the words, "Feed my lambs." Mrs. Price Ridley arrived first, sails set for gossip. She wore mauve bombazine despite the heat and carried a parasol the color of overripe damsons. "Jane," she announced, collapsing into a chair with the air of a ship docking. "I have never been so overset. Clarence Polk, dead, at the fete, in front of the Belgian refugees' stall." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, pouring tea with the steadiness of long practice. "Milk, Clara?" "2 lumps, and don't spare the milk. My nerves are all to pieces." Mrs. Price Ridley fanned herself with the church newsletter. "Dr. Haydock says heart, but I say poison. My cousin's husband's aunt dropped just the same way at a garden party in Torquay. Nightshade in the clotted cream. They hushed it up, of course. The family was in trade." Miss Marple's needles clicked. She was knitting a premature baby's bonnet for the Belgian Fund. Tiny, intricate, the wool so fine it might have been spun by spiders. "Nightshade has a different smell, Clara." And Mr. Polk's lips were blue. "Blue!" Mrs. Price Ridley's voice rose to a squeak that startled the blackbird into silence. "Then it was poison, I knew it. Dolores Bantry's scones, everyone knows she's at her wit's end since Arthur and that land girl." "Shh." Miss Dane Calthrop appeared in the French doors, wiping flour from her forearms. She was tall, untidy, and possessed of a serenity that came from believing the best of everyone until proven otherwise. "Dolores will be here presently. We mustn't judge." "Judge?" Mrs. Price Ridley snorted. "When a man drops dead after eating her baking?" The garden gate creaked. Colonel Arbuthnot stumped in, leaning on a Malacca cane that had seen service in Mesopotamia. His blazer was brushed, his mustache waxed to bayonet points, but his eyes were bloodshot. "Afternoon, ladies? Vicar about?" "In the study wrestling with Sunday's sermon," Mrs. Dane Calthrop said. "Tea, Colonel?" "Whiskey," the Colonel growled, then caught Miss Marple's mild gaze and relented. "Tea, then. Dash of milk, no sugar, can't abide sweetness." He lowered himself into a chair which protested. "Damned shame about Polk. Steady sort. Lent me a $5 once when the regimental reunion ran over budget." Miss Marple poured. "You were at the cake stall when it happened, Colonel." "Standing right there. Saw the fellow bite, chew, swallow, then keel over like a 9-pin. Thought at first he'd choked on a currant." The Colonel's left hand trembled as he raised the cup. Tea slopped into the saucer. He swore under his breath and set it down untouched. Mrs. Price Ridley leaned forward, parasol quivering. "Did you notice anything odd, Colonel? A strange taste? A funny smell?" "Smelled of scones," the Colonel said shortly. "Butter, raisins, oven. Nothing funny about it." Miss Hartnell arrived next, ledger under one arm, face pinched as a winter apple. She wore bottle green silk that rustled like dry leaves. "I must speak to the vicar about the tombola discrepancy," she announced to no one in particular. 3 shillings missing. Again. "Later, Miss Hartnell," Mrs. Dane Calthrop said gently. "Tea first. You look quite done in." Miss Hartnell sat, backbone rigid. "I am not done in. I am concerned. The Belgian Fund cannot absorb losses, and now this tragedy on top of everything." Her eyes flicked to the scone plate, then away as though it might bite. Miss Marple offered the plate. "Scone, Miss Hartnell. Mrs. Dane Calthrops are quite safe, I assure you." Miss Hartnell recoiled. "Certainly not. I never touch raisins. Upset my digestion." Dr. Haydock was the last to arrive, medical bag clutched like a talisman. His pipe was unlit, his face gray beneath the tan. "Ladies, Colonel," he nodded curtly and accepted tea standing. "County pathologist's on his way. Preliminary examination suggests coronary thrombosis. We'll know more after the post-mortem." Coronary? Mrs. Price Ridley's voice could have cut glass. With blue lips? Dr. Haydock's jaw tightened. Congestion of the lungs can cause cyanosis. Happens in heart cases. Miss Marple set down her cup. And the faint almond scent, doctor? I noticed it quite distinctly. The doctor's eyes met hers, steady but with a flicker of something unreadable. Imagination, Miss Marple. Or perhaps the marzipan fancies on the next stall. Almond essence is common in baking. Yet Mr. Polk ate a raisin scone, Miss Marple said mildly. No marzipan. Silence fell, broken only by the blackbird resuming its scales. The mulberry leaves rustled overhead, dropping a single purple fruit that burst on the flagstones like a drop of blood. Tommy Pierce appeared at the garden gate, cap in hand, freckles standing out against sudden pallor. Begging your pardon, Miss Marple. Mrs. Dane Calthrop said I was to bring the evening post. He held out a small bundle tied with string. And I saw Summit at the fete. Thought you ought to know. Mrs. Dane Calthrop took the post. Come in, Tommy, sit down. You look as though you've seen a ghost. Tommy perched on the edge of a chair, knees jiggling. It were the colonel, miss, before the judging. I was delivering telegrams to the post office tent and I saw him, Colonel Arbuthnot, poking about the cake stall. Had a little glass bottle in his pocket, clear-like, with a cork stopper. Looked like medicine. The colonel's teacup rattled violently in its saucer. What's this damned impudence? I was admiring the marrow display. Opposite side of the green, Colonel, Miss Marple said gently. The cake stall is by the cedar. The colonel's face purpled. Memory's not what it was. War wound, shrapnel in the head. Mix things up sometimes. Dr. Haydock set his cup down with care. Glass bottle, you say? Could have been anything, eye drops, nose drops. I prescribe them all the time. Tommy shook his head. Weren't drops. Smelled funny when he uncorked it, sharp-like. Like the chemist's when me mum buys rat poison for the barn. Mrs. Price Ridley gasped. Miss Hartnell's ledger slipped to the grass with a thud. The colonel stared at Tommy as though the boy had sprouted horns. Miss Marple's needles never paused. And did you see the colonel use this bottle, Tommy? No, miss. Just saw him put it back in his pocket. Then Mrs. Bantry come over and shooed him off. Said the judging was about to start. Mrs. Dane Calthrop's serene face had gone very still. Tommy, are you quite sure? Cross me heart, ma'am, I know what I saw. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat. Boys exaggerate, especially when there's drama. I'll thank you not to spread rumors, young man. Mr. Polk's family is distressed enough. Tommy's chin jutted. Ain't a rumor if it's true. Miss Marple laid her knitting aside. The tiny bonnet was nearly finished, delicate as lace, innocent as morning. Tommy, did you notice anything else? Anything at all? The boy hesitated, then reached into his pocket. Found this by the cake stall after they took Mr. Polk away. Thought it might be important. He held out a scrap of paper, crumpled and grass-stained. Looks like it's torn off Summit. Miss Marple took it with steady fingers. The paper was thick, creamy, prescription stationery. Dr. Haydock's letterhead was faintly visible at the top, though the bottom third had been ripped away. What remained read, pot, cyan jardatou sig. One to be dissolved in water and used as directed. Dr. J. Haydock, MRCS. The garden seemed to hold its breath. Even the blackbird fell silent. Dr. Haydock stared at the scrap as though it were a snake. That's not possible. My pad is in my surgery, locked. Yet here it is, Miss Marple said softly. Torn as though to remove the patient's name. Miss Hartnell found her voice. Cyanide. I knew it. Rat poison. I purchased some only last week for the church mice. The vestry was overrun. Mrs. Price Ridley's parasol clattered to the ground. You bought cyanide? At the same fate where... For the mice, Miss Hartnell snapped. Sealed tin. Locked in the vestry cupboard. I have the key. The colonel stood abruptly, chair scraping. This is outrageous. Accusations flying like shrapnel. I've had enough. He stumped toward the gate, cane thumping. Miss Marple watched him go. Curious, she murmured. The colonel's tremor is worse when he's agitated, and he spilled his tea, yet his cup was barely touched. Dr. Haydock lit his pipe at last, hands not quite steady. I'll examine that scrap, Miss Marple. Could be a forgery or a mistake. Or the truth, Mrs. Dane Calthrop said quietly. She had been standing in the doorway unnoticed, a plate of fresh scones in her hands. Jane, you will stay to dinner? The vicar insists. Miss Marple smiled. I should be delighted, though perhaps we might avoid raisins. Tommy lingered as the others drifted indoors. Miss Marple, you believe me, don't you? About the bottle? I believe you saw something, Tommy. Whether it was a bottle of eye drops or something more sinister remains to be seen. But you were very brave to speak up. She pressed a sixpence into his hand. Now run along, and keep your eyes open. But your mouth closed unless you're speaking to me or Constable Polk. Tommy grinned, pocketed the coin, and vanished through the gate with the speed of youth. Indoors, the vicarage drawing room was cool and dim, smelling of beeswax and old prayer books. The vicar, mild, bewildered, perpetually surprised by the wickedness of the world, poured sherry with a trembling hand. Mrs. Bantry had arrived, hat discarded, eyes red-rimmed. She clutched a handkerchief like a life raft. I can't bear it, she whispered to Miss Marple. They're saying my scone killed him. Clarence was a friend. He lent Arthur money when the hall roof collapsed. And now, Miss Marple patted her hand. We must wait for the pathologist, Dolores. Accidents happen. But the special scone, I made it for Sir Henry. Clarence took it by mistake. If I'd only... Hush! Miss Marple's voice was gentle steel. Regret is a luxury we cannot afford. Tell me, did you notice anyone near the stall before the judging? Anyone who shouldn't have been? Mrs. Bantry dabbed her eyes. Only the colonel. He was hovering like a broody hen. Said he wanted to check the marrow entries, but they were on the other side. Then Miss Hartnell came flapping about the takings, and Dr. Haydock stopped to ask if I had aspirin. Said he'd run out. Miss Marple filed each detail away, neat as pins in a cushion. Dinner was a subdued affair. Poached salmon, new potatoes, peas from the vicarage garden. Conversation tiptoed around the tragedy until Mrs. Price Ridley, emboldened by sherry, demanded to know whether the fate takings would be returned. Miss Hartnell bristled. Certainly not. The Belgian refugees, can wait, Mrs. Price Ridley said, until we know whether the scones were safe. The vicar murmured something about Christian charity. Dr. Haydock excused himself early, citing a patient. The colonel had not returned. Chapter 3. The Post Office Confessional. The post office in St. Mary Mead opened its doors at 8:30 sharp, come rain, shine, or the aftermath of sudden death. On this particular morning, the brass bell above the door gave its usual cheerful jangle, but the sound felt muffled, as though the village itself were holding its breath behind net curtains. Miss Marple entered at 8:37, precisely 2 minutes after the postmistress, Mrs. Dane Calthrop's sister-in-law, Miss Weatherby, had unlocked the grill. She carried a small string bag containing 3 ounces of 4-ply wool, heather mixture, and a polite fiction about posting a letter to her nephew Raymond in London. In truth, the letter had been posted the previous evening. The wool was merely camouflage. The post office smelled of ink, boiled sweets, and the particular staleness that clings to places where gossip is weighed more carefully than parcels. Behind the counter, Miss Weatherby, tall, angular, with a voice like a filing cabinet, sorted the morning delivery with the efficiency of a woman who had once run the WAF coding section. "Morning, Miss Marple," she said without looking up. "Terrible business about Mr. Polk. My sister says the vicarage was packed with speculation last night." "Speculation is a luxury we cannot yet afford, Gladys," Miss Marple replied, placing her bag on the counter, "though I confess I am here for more than wool." Miss Weatherby's eyebrows rose a fraction, the post office equivalent of a gasp. "Information, then?" "Observation," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Tell me, did Mr. Polk receive any unusual post yesterday? A telegram, perhaps? Or a parcel?" Miss Weatherby's fingers paused over a bundle of buff envelopes. "Funny you should ask. He collected a registered letter at noon, thick cream envelope, London postmark. Looked official, bank maybe, or solicitor. He signed for it himself right here." She tapped the ledger with a pen that leaked slightly. "Clarence Polk, 12:03 p.m. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "And was he alone?" "No. Colonel Arbuthnot was with him. Said he was posting a letter to his nephew in Kenya. Lingered a good 5 minutes after Mr. Polk left. Kept asking about postal rates to the colonies. Most unlike him, he usually barks and departs." Miss Marple filed this away. "And the colonel's hands, did you notice if they trembled?" "Like a tuning fork," Miss Weatherby said promptly. "Spilled ink on the blotter. I had to give him a fresh form, said it was the heat." At that moment, the bell jangled again, and Mrs. Dane Calthrop swept in, flower on her sleeve and urgency in her eyes. She spotted Miss Marple and made a beeline, ignoring the queue forming behind her. "Jane, thank heavens, I've been looking for you." She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper that carried to the back wall. "I found this in the vestry rubbish bin." From her pocket she produced a crumpled scrap of paper, folded small. "It was under yesterday's hymn sheets." Miss Marple took it with the same care she might handle a Fabergé egg. The paper was identical to the torn prescription fragment from the previous evening. Dr. Haydock's stationery, thick and creamy. This piece, however, contained the missing portion, for the destruction of vermin only, to be kept under lock and key. Patient, Mrs. A. Bantry, Gossington Hall. Date, 4th August. Mrs. A. Bantry, Dolores, the special scone. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Curious. Mrs. Bantry has no vermin at the hall, only Arthur's spaniels, and they are remarkably well behaved. Mrs. Dane Calthrop's serene face was troubled. "I thought the same. And the date. Yesterday. The very day of the fate." Miss Weatherby leaned over the counter, eyes bright with curiosity. "Cyanide, isn't it? My cousin in the Home Guard says they use it for wasp nests. 1 teaspoon in syrup." "Thank you, Gladys," Miss Marple said firmly. "We mustn't leap to conclusions, though I confess the coincidence is striking." The bell jangled once more, and Miss Hartnell entered like a ship under full sail, ledger clutched to her bosom. Her bottle green silk had been replaced by severe navy, but the expression was unchanged. Lemon souffle definitely collapsed. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Dane Calthrop, I must speak to you both, privately." She cast a withering glance at Miss Weatherby, who retreated behind her grill with wounded dignity. Mrs. Dane Calthrop sighed. "The side room, then. Gladys, would you mind the shop?" The side room was a narrow space smelling of sealing wax and old ledgers. A single window overlooked the churchyard, where rooks were holding a noisy parliament in the yews. Miss Hartnell shut the door with a click that sounded suspiciously final. "I have a confession," she announced. Her voice trembled, but whether from fear or indignation was hard to tell. "The rat poison, the tin I purchased for the church mice, it's gone. Miss Marple's needles appeared as if by magic. She was knitting a border of tiny leaves, delicate as frost. Gone, Miss Hartnell? Stolen? Or misplaced, Miss Hartnell said defensively. I locked it in the vestry cupboard, as I told you, but this morning, empty, tin and all. Only a smear of white powder on the shelf. Mrs. Dane Calthrop's eyes widened. You're certain it was cyanide? Label said potassium cyanide, poison, skull and crossbones. I'm not a fool. Miss Hartnell's chin jutted. Though why anyone would steal it, unless, Miss Marple said softly, they needed it for something other than mice. Miss Hartnell's face crumpled. You think I think, Miss Marple said, that someone knew the tin was there. Someone with access to the vestry key. Miss Hartnell flushed. The key hangs on a hook by the vestry door. Anyone could have taken it. Anyone who knew the church routine, Mrs. Dane Calthrop murmured. Morning prayer, flower rota, choir practice. The door opened a crack, and Tommy Pierce's freckled face appeared. Beggin' pardon, ladies. Postmistress said you was in here. Got a message for Miss Marple. He held out a folded note. From Dr. Haydock. Says it's urgent. Miss Marple took the note. The handwriting was hurried but legible. Miss M., county pathologist, confirms cyanide. Trace and gastric contents. Police on way. Suggest you examine scone remnants before they are seized. H. She folded the note with care. Thank you, Tommy. Did you deliver the Morning Post to Gossington Hall? Tommy nodded. Mrs. Bantry was in the still room crying fit to bust. Cook gave me $1 to keep quiet about it. Miss Hartnell bristled. Blackmail, boy? No, ma'am, just sympathy. Tommy's ears reddened. Though I did see summit else. In the rubbish bin by the kitchen door looked like burnt paper, bits of a ledger maybe. Smelled funny like chemicals. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Burnt ledger? At Gossington Hall? Tommy nodded. And Colonel Arbuthnot, he was there too. Early. Said he was returning a book to Mr. Bantry, but Mr. Bantry's in London till tomorrow. Mrs. Dane Calthrop exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. The Colonel again. Miss Hartnell opened her ledger with a snap. Speaking of ledgers, mine shows a discrepancy. £47, 12 shillings, 6pence. Exactly the sum needed to cover my brother's gambling debts in Torquay. I've been borrowing from the Belgian fund, temporarily. I intended to repay it after the fete. Miss Marple's needles paused. And the rat poison tin. Did you open it, Miss Hartnell? To destroy evidence, perhaps? Miss Hartnell's face went the color of parchment. I opened it, yes, to check the contents. But I never touched the powder, I swear it. Mrs. Dane Calthrop laid a gentle hand on her arm. We believe you, Emmeline. But someone else may not. Outside, the church clock struck 9. The rooks scattered like black confetti. Miss Marple rose, folding her knitting with care. I must visit the bakery, she said, and then Gossington Hall. Mrs. Bantry's still room may hold more than lavender bags. Tommy lingered as the ladies prepared to leave. Miss Marple, you'll tell the police about the Colonel's bottle, won't you? I ain't fibbin'. Miss Marple smiled. I shall tell them exactly what you saw, Tommy, and perhaps a little more. The bakery was a low building next to the forge. Its windows steamed with the breath of ovens. Mrs. Baker, round, flowery, and possessed of a laugh like rising dough, greeted Miss Marple with surprise. Miss Marple, at this hour? Not more scones, surely? Just questions, Mrs. Baker, about yesterday's batch for the fete. Mrs. Baker wiped her hands on her apron. 50 scones baked fresh at dawn. Mrs. Bantry's recipe, though she insisted on glazing one special with extra honey. Said it was for the judge. I thought it odd. She usually leaves the glazing to me. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. And the currants. Did you notice anything unusual? Mrs. Baker frowned. Come to think of it, yes. One currant was larger than the rest, almost like a raisin, but darker. Mrs. Bantry brought it herself. Said it was a special Greek currant, air-dried. Told me to put it in the judge's scone, dead center. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. And did you? I did, though it was fiddly. Had to press it in after baking so as not to sink. The glaze sealed it neat as you like. Outside, the forge hammer rang against iron, steady as a pulse. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Baker and stepped into the lane, where Tommy Pierce waited with his bicycle. Gossington Hall next, she said. And Tommy, keep your eyes open for burnt paper or glass bottles. The hall's kitchen garden was fragrant with rosemary and regret. Cook, red-eyed, admitted Miss Marple to the still room, a cool, stone-flagged chamber lined with jars of potpourri and drying herbs. Mrs. Bantry sat at the table, a ledger open before her, tears blotching the ink. Jane, she whispered, they're saying I poisoned Clarence, but I loved him like a brother. He knew about Arthur and the land girl, said he'd keep it quiet if I paid him £500. I was desperate. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. And the special currant? Mrs. Bantry's hands twisted. I found it in the vestry cupboard, hollow with white powder inside. I thought it was hartshorn for smelling salts. I only wanted to make Sir Henry ill, humiliate him for snubbing me. I injected the powder with a glazing needle, but Clarence took the wrong plate. Miss Marple's blood ran cold. You knew it was poison? I suspected, Mrs. Bantry sobbed. But I was so angry. At that moment, the kitchen door burst open. Colonel Arbuthnot stood there, face thunderous, a burnt scrap of paper in his hand. Dolores, you fool, he barked. This ledger page, I found it in the boiler, your handwriting. My inheritance money funneled to Paulk to keep quiet about my nephew's forgery. You've ruined us all, Mrs. Bantry shrieked. The ledger fell, pages scattering like white birds. Miss Marple stepped forward, calm as morning. Colonel, the police will be here soon. I suggest we all wait in the drawing room. But as they moved toward the door, Tommy Pierce's voice rang out from the garden. Miss Marple, quick, the dustbin. In the ash bin, half buried under cabbage leaves, lay a small glass vial. Cork stopper missing, label faded but legible. Pot, cyan, and beside it a single hollow currant, its pinprick hole glistening with honey. The church clock struck the quarter. Somewhere, a rook cawed once like a warning. Chapter 4. The Hollow Currant. The morning mist still clung to the churchyard yews when Miss Marple stepped out of Gossington Hall's kitchen door. The hollow currant, an empty vial cradled in her handkerchief like fragile eggs. Behind her, Mrs. Bantry's sobs echoed down the stone corridor, punctuated by Colonel Arbuthnot's barked orders to cook to fetch brandy. Tommy Pierce hovered at the garden gate, bicycle propped against the rosemary hedge, eyes saucer-wide with the thrill of discovery. Blimey, Miss Marple, he whispered. That's the same bottle I saw the Colonel with, and the currant, look, it's got a little plug of wax in the hole now like someone tried to seal it after. Miss Marple knelt, awkwardly for her knees protested, and examined the currant with the magnifying glass she now carried everywhere like a talisman. The wax was pale yellow, beeswax from the hall hives. The pinprick had been widened slightly, then stoppered. A faint white residue dusted the interior, crystalline and deadly. Tommy, she said quietly, run to the police station. Tell Constable Paulk to telephone Inspector Craddock in Much Benham. Say we have evidence of cyanide poisoning and possible attempted murder. Then cycle to Dr. Haydock's surgery and ask him, politely, to meet me at my cottage in half an hour. Do not mention the vial. Tommy touched his cap and pedaled off, tires hissing on the gravel. Miss Marple straightened, tucking the handkerchief into her sleeve. The church clock struck 9:15. Rooks wheeled overhead like black scraps of burnt paper. Her cottage, Dane's cottage, though no Dane had lived there since 1897, stood at the end of the lane, its thatched roof golden in the strengthening sun. She let herself in, the latch clicking with familiar comfort, and went straight to the sitting room. On the gate-legged table lay the previous evening's knitting, the premature baby's bonnet now complete save for its ribbon. She set the currant and vial beside it, then fetched her nephew's old chemistry set from the attic, a relic of his brief enthusiasm for explosives. The magnifying glass revealed more. The currant's hollow had been expertly carved, the interior smoothed with a fine blade. A single grain of cyanide, enough to kill a rat or a man, clung to the wax. Miss Marple decanted it into a clean pillbox labeled in her neat copper plate, Evidence, 5th August. The doorbell chimed. Dr. Haydock stood on the step, medical bag in hand, pipe clenched unlit between his teeth. His face was drawn, the tan had faded to parchment. "Miss Marple," he said without preamble. "Craddock's on his way. The post-mortem confirms cyanide, massive dose, absorbed rapidly, death within 2 minutes, and now you've found—" His eyes fell on the currant and vial. He swore softly, a soldier's oath from the war. "Indeed," Miss Marple said, "though I confess I am puzzled. The currant was hollowed before baking. Mrs. Baker confirmed it. Yet the poison was injected after through the glaze. Someone had access to the finished scone." Dr. Haydock set his bag down. "My prescription pad. Another page is missing. I noticed this morning. And the vestry tin. Empty. Someone is being very thorough." Miss Marple poured tea from the pot she had kept warm beneath a cozy knitted like a cottage loaf. "Tell me, doctor, cyanide for vermin. Who in the village has requested it recently?" Haydock rubbed his temples. "Mrs. Bantry. Last week for wasps in the attic. Miss Hartnell for church mice. Colonel Arbuthnot claimed jackdaws in his chimney. All legitimate on the surface. Yet only one scone was poisoned," Miss Marple murmured. "The special scone glazed separately, intended for Sir Henry Clithering according to Mrs. Bantry, but Mr. Paulk took it by mistake." Haydock's pipe trembled. "Sir Henry, good Lord, if he'd eaten it—" "Precisely." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Though I wonder Mrs. Bantry's confession was convenient. Too convenient, perhaps. She claims she found the hollow currant in the vestry, suspected poison, yet used it anyway to sicken Sir Henry. A woman desperate enough to poison might also be desperate enough to lie." The doorbell chimed again. Constable Paulk, red-faced, helmet under arm, stood panting on the step. "Miss Marple, message from Inspector Craddock. He'll be here by 11. Says to secure the scene and not touch anything." Too late for that, I reckon?" Miss Marple smiled. "I have touched very little, Constable, though I suggest you photograph the dustbin at Gossington Hall before the gardener empties it, and take statements from Cook and Tommy Pierce." Paulk scratched his head. "Cook's in hysterics, and the boys vanished. Said something about delivering telegrams to the Blue Boar." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "The Blue Boar? Curious." She saw the constable out, then returned to the table. Using tweezers from the Chemistry 34 chemistry set, she carefully extracted the wax plug. Inside the currant, more white powder and something else, a scrap of paper folded microscopically small. She teased it out with a needle. The paper was thin, onion skin, the kind used for carbon copies, in pencil barely legible. "Meet me. Bell Tower, 3 a.m. T.T. Tommy, or someone else?" Dr. Haydock peered over her shoulder. "Blackmail? Or a trap?" Miss Marple said. "The Bell Tower, accessible only by the spiral stair, no witnesses after midnight." The clock struck 10. Outside, the village stirred. Mrs. Price, Ridley's maid, hanging washing with exaggerated care. Miss Hartnell marching toward the church with a face like thunder. Colonel Arbuthnot's gardener burning something in the bonfire that smelled sharply of chemicals. Miss Marple wrapped the currant vial in paper in separate envelopes, sealing each with wax. "Doctor, may I borrow your microscope? The county lab will be days." Haydock hesitated, then nodded. "I'll fetch it. And Miss Marple, be careful. Whoever did this is still in the village." Left alone, Miss Marple opened her desk drawer and took out a small notebook bound in Morocco leather. In it she began to write. Suspects, Mrs. Bantry. Motive, silence, paltry affair. Intended victim, Sir Henry. Colonel Arbuthnot, vial, tremor, burnt papers, nephew's forgery. Miss Hartnell, missing rat poison. Embezzlement, 4712 6th. Dr. Haydock, prescription pad, access to cyanide. Tommy Pierce, saw too much. Note in current? She paused, then added, clues. Hollow current carved pre-baking, Mrs. Baker. Poison injected post-baking, glaze needle track. Wax seal added after fate, Hall Hives. Note, T. Bell Tower, 3 a.m. Burnt ledger at Hall, Mrs. Bantry's hand. The microscope arrived via Haydock's gardener's boy. Miss Marple adjusted the lens, heart quickening. The white powder dissolved in water on a slide revealed perfect cubic crystals. Potassium cyanide. The paper scrap bore fingerprints, two clear, one smudged. The clear prints were small, childlike. Tommy's? At 10:47, the doorbell rang a third time. Mrs. Price Ridley stood there, parasol dripping despite the sun, face white as milk. "Jane," she gasped, "you must come at once. Miss Hartnell, she's collapsed in the church, says she's been poisoned, cyanide in her morning coffee." Miss Marple grabbed her hat. "Dr. Haydock." "Already gone," Mrs. Price Ridley panted. "I telephoned from the post office." The church was cool and dim, smelling of candle wax and lilies. Miss Hartnell lay on a pew near the vestry door, ledger clutched to her chest, lips blue. Dr. Haydock knelt beside her, forcing something between her teeth. "Emetics," he said grimly. "She'll live, barely. Coffee dregs on the vestry table, almond smell." Miss Marple knelt, noting the spilled cup, the open ledger. A page had been torn out. The stub showed 47 $12 6th in red ink. On the floor, another hollow current, crushed white powder scattered like salt. "Someone tried to silence her," Haydock said. "Same method." Miss Marple's eyes fell on the vestry cupboard, door ajar, key in the lock. Inside, the empty rat poison tin, lid off, a smear of honey on the rim. "Honey," she murmured. "From the Hall Hives. Someone used the tin to transport the poisoned current, then returned it empty." Miss Hartnell stirred, moaning. "The boy, Tommy, thought he saw me take the money. Said he'd tell unless—" Miss Marple's blood ran cold. "Where is Tommy now?" Haydock's face was grim. "The Blue Boar cellar. Landlady found him an hour ago, hanging from a beam, staged as suicide, but the rope marks murder," Miss Marple finished. She stood, steadying herself on the pew. 3 attempts, 1 success, and the bell tower at 3 a.m., a meeting that never happened. Outside, Inspector Craddock's car crunched on the gravel. Miss Marple tucked the envelopes into her handbag. "Doctor," she said quietly, "I believe the killer is still in the village, and they are running out of time." The church clock struck 11. Somewhere a rook cawed once, like a warning. Chapter 5. The Alibi Clock. The church clock of St. Mary Mead had always been a liar. For 37 years it had run 5 minutes slow, a fact known to every villager from the vicar to the verger. Yet on the morning of the 5th of August, as Inspector Craddock's black Wolseley nosed into the churchyard, the clock struck 11 with the smug punctuality of a man who has just discovered virtue. Miss Marple stood beneath the lich gate, handbag clutched like a hymnal, watching the minute hand jerk forward. "Curious," she murmured to the empty air. "Someone has been tampering with time." Inspector Craddock, tall, lean, with the weary eyes of a man who had seen too many garden fates turn grim, strode toward her, notebook already open. "Miss Marple, you telephoned, said you had evidence." "Several pieces," she replied, "though none yet conclusive. Shall we walk? The churchyard is pleasant, and the rooks are less likely to gossip than Mrs. Price Ridley." They moved along the gravel path, past mossy headstones and a marble angel whose nose had been chipped by a German bomb in '41. Dr. Haydock followed at a distance, medical bag swinging, pipe clenched unlit. Behind them, Constable Paul cordoned off the vestry with red tape that looked embarrassingly festive. Craddock flipped a page. "Let's have it then. Cyanide in a scone, 1 dead banker, 1 attempted poisoning, Miss Hartnell recovering, 1 staged suicide, Tommy Pierce, rope marks inconsistent with hanging, and a hollow current that sings when tapped." "Begin at the beginning." Miss Marple began with the fate, the special scone, the glaze, the pinprick. She produced the envelopes one by one. Currant, vial, wax plug, microscopic note. Craddock's eyebrows climbed with each reveal. "The note," he said, holding the onion skin to the light. "Meet me, Bell Tower, 3 a.m. T. Tommy Pierce's initial?" "Or a forgery," Miss Marple said. "The paper is carbon copy used by the post office for telegrams. Tommy delivered telegrams. But so did others." They reached the south porch. The church door stood ajar. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of dust and lilies left too long in water. Miss Hartnell sat propped on a cushion in the front pew, a rug over her knees, face the color of porridge. A police matron hovered with a cup of beef tea. "Feeling better, Miss Hartnell?" Craddock asked. "Like death warmed over," she snapped. "But alive. The Lord preserved me for a purpose, probably to see justice done." Her eyes flicked to Miss Marple. "Though some might say I deserved it after the Belgian fund." Craddock ignored the bait. "Your coffee, where did it come from?" "The vestry kettle. I brewed it myself at 8:30, left it on the table while I opened the cupboard for hymn sheets. Anyone could have slipped in." Miss Marple knelt by the vestry table. The spilled coffee had dried to a dark stain. The cup lay on its side, a faint almond scent lingering. She lifted the saucer with a handkerchief. Beneath, a second hollow current, intact, its wax plug pristine. "Another," she said softly. Prepared in advance. The killer brought 2 poisoned currants to the church, 1 for the scone, 1 for Miss Hartnell's cup. Craddock whistled. "Premeditation. And the boy?" "Tommy saw the tampering," Miss Marple said. "He told me at the vicarage tea. Someone overheard, or he boasted later at the Blue Boar. The Bell Tower meeting was a lure." They moved to the tower stair, a narrow spiral of worn stone, damp with centuries of footsteps. The bell chamber above smelled of rope and pigeon feathers. Tommy Pierce's body had been cut down at dawn. Chalk marks outlined where his boots had scraped the wall. Craddock pointed to the beam. "Rope tied here, then thrown over, but the knots are sailor's knots. Tommy was a landlubber. And the lividity. Blood pooled in the feet, not the head. He was dead before he was strung up." Miss Marple examined the chalk marks. "He was carried up after midnight. The church clock would have been visible from the tower window. Our killer needed an alibi." She led Craddock to the clock mechanism, a dusty iron cage of gears and pendulums behind the bell chamber. The hands had been advanced manually. Fresh scratches marred the brass. A small key lay on the floor, vestry key identical to Miss Hartnell's. "Someone reset the clock to strike 11 at 10:55, Miss Marple said, "creating a 5-minute window." If witnesses heard the clock strike during the murder, they would swear the time was wrong. Craddock's eyes narrowed. Who has access to the tower? The bell ringers, Thursday practice, the verger. Miss Hartnell for flower rota. Colonel Arbuthnot. He was a ringer before the war. And Tommy, who cleaned the brasses for sixpence. They descended. Outside, the village green shimmered in noon heat. Mrs. Price Ridley's maid was taking down the bunting with mournful tugs. The cake stall had been dismantled. Only the cedar remained, its branches sweeping the grass like a mourner's veil. Dr. Haydock joined them. I've examined the boy's stomach contents, trace cyanide. He was poisoned first, then hanged. The killer used a third current crushed into his beer at the Blue Boar. Craddock flipped his notebook shut. Means, motive, opportunity. Let's take them one by one. They walked to the Blue Boar. The landlady, Mrs. Burt, vast, red-armed, with a voice like a foghorn, met them at the door. Cellar's locked now, poor lad. Found him at 6, swinging like a side of beef. The cellar was cool and dim, smelling of ale and apples. Chalk marks outlined Tommy's body. A broken glass lay nearby, dregs dried to sticky amber. Miss Marple sniffed. Hops, malt, and the faintest whisper of almonds. His usual half-pint, Mrs. Burt said. Paid for by a gentleman, said it was Tommy's birthday. Dark coat, hat pulled low, didn't see the face. Craddock bagged the glass. Fingerprints? Wiped clean, Haydock said. But the current fragments. Same wax, same hollow. Back in the sunlight, Miss Marple paused by the war memorial. 3 poisonings, 1 method. The killer prepared multiple currents. Insurance, perhaps, if the first failed. But why Mr. Polk? And why spare Sir Henry? Craddock lit a cigarette. Blackmail. Polk knew something about Mrs. Bantry's affair, the colonel's nephew, Miss Hartnell's embezzlement. Take your pick. Or all 3, Miss Marple said. A conspiracy silenced by scones. They proceeded to Gossington Hall. Mrs. Bantry received them in the morning room, eyes swollen, hands twisting a sodden handkerchief. Colonel Arbuthnot stood by the window, ramrod straight, a glass of whiskey untouched on the sill. I've confessed, Mrs. Bantry said brokenly. The special current, I injected it to sicken Sir Henry. He snubbed me at the county show, but Clarence took the plate by mistake. Craddock's voice was gentle but firm. And the second current? For Miss Hartnell? Mrs. Bantry shook her head. I knew nothing of that, or the boy. The colonel snorted. Lies. She burnt the ledger, my inheritance money paid to Polk to hush up my nephew's forgery in Nairobi. I found the ashes in the boiler. Miss Marple's eyes moved to the colonel's hands. The tremor was worse. Whiskey slopped over the rim. You were seen at the hall this morning, Colonel, returning a book to Mr. Bantry, who is in London. Borrowed a treatise on tropical diseases, the colonel barked. My nephew's ill. Yet the book is still on the library shelf, Miss Marple said mildly. I checked. Silence fell, broken only by the tick of the ormolu clock. Mrs. Bantry began to sob again. Craddock turned to the colonel. Your alibi for 3 a.m.? Asleep, alone, servant's day off. And the glass vial Tommy saw. Eye drops, the colonel said. Cataracts. Prescribed by Haydock. Haydock's face was stone. I prescribed saline, no cyanide. They left the hall and walked to the doctor's surgery, a neat red brick house with a brass plate polished to a gleam. Haydock's prescription pad lay open on the desk, 3 pages missing, edges torn cleanly. Someone took them yesterday, he said, while I was at the fete. Miss Marple examined the pad. The tears are slanted, left-handed. You are right-handed, doctor. Mrs. Bantry, too. Miss Hartnell writes with her right. The colonel. Left-handed, Craddock finished. From the war, shrapnel in the right arm. They moved to the colonel's cottage, a squat, ugly house with a garden overrun by nettles. The gardener was burning rubbish. The smoke smelled sharply of chemicals. In the ashes, fragments of a ledger, 47 $12, 6 deed visible in red ink. Craddock bagged the fragments. Miss Hartnell's embezzlement. The colonel was covering for her or blackmailing her. Inside, the house was orderly to the point of obsession. On the desk, a sailor's knot manual open to a page on hangman's nooses, and in the wastepaper basket a hollow current crushed, its wax plug melted. Miss Marple's heart pounded. He kept a souvenir. They searched the garden. Beneath the bonfire, half-burned, a glass vial, label charred but legible, pot, cyan, and a small glazing needle, its eye clogged with honey. Craddock's voice was grim. Enough for an arrest, but Miss Marple stayed his hand. One piece missing, the clock. Who reset it to strike 11 at 10:55? The colonel was seen at the hall at dawn, too late for a 3 a.m. tampering. They returned to the church. The clock mechanism showed fresh fingerprints, large, smudged with oil, bell ringer's hands. The verger, Craddock said, or a shadow moved in the bell chamber. Dr. Haydock stood there, face pale, a spanner in his hand. I advanced the clock, he said quietly. At 2:45 a.m. the colonel asked me to, said it was for the sunrise service. I thought nothing of it. Craddock's eyes narrowed. You lied. I protected a patient, Haydock said. Until I realized, Miss Marple's voice cut through. You realized the colonel poisoned Tommy to silence him, and tried to poison Miss Hartnell to cover the embezzlement. But the scone. Why Mr. Polk? Haydock's shoulders sagged. Polk discovered the colonel was selling regimental silver to fund his nephew's escape from Nairobi. Threatened exposure. The scone was meant for Polk all along, Sir Henry a red herring. The church clock struck the quarter, correctly now at 2:15. Somewhere a rook cawed once like a verdict. Craddock snapped handcuffs on the colonel's wrists as the sun dipped behind the yews. Mrs. Bantry watched from the hall steps, tears drying on her cheeks. Miss Hartnell, wrapped in a blanket, nodded once. Justice at last. Miss Marple walked home through the twilight, knitting needles silent in her bag. The village green was empty now. Bunting gone, only the cedar sweeping the grass like a mourner's veil. She paused at her gate. Time, she murmured, is a slippery thing. But truth has a way of striking the hour. Chapter 6. The Torn Prescription. The drawing room of Gossington Hall smelled of beeswax, grief, and the ghost of brandy. Mrs. Bantry sat on the edge of a chintz sofa, spine straight for the first time in days, a fresh handkerchief twisted between her fingers. Colonel Arbuthnot stood by the mantel, wrists cuffed, face the color of old parchment. Inspector Craddock leaned against the door frame, notebook closed. Dr. Haydock lingered near the window, pipe cold. Miss Marple occupied the small tapestry chair, knitting a border of tiny violets, needles clicking like a metronome. Craddock spoke first. Colonel Arbuthnot, you are charged with the murder of Clarence Polk, the attempted murder of Emmeline Hartnell, and the murder of Thomas Pierce. Anything you say... The colonel cut him off with a bark. Poppycock, I'm 82, couldn't climb the bell tower if I tried. Miss Marple's voice was soft. Yet you tied sailor's knots with your left hand, Colonel. Shrapnel spared the tendons. And you reset the church clock at 2:45 a.m. Dr. Haydock confirmed it. Haydock nodded. I advanced the hands 5 minutes. Thought it was for the sunrise service. My mistake. Mrs. Bantry's handkerchief shredded. But the scone, my scone, was meant for Sir Henry. I confessed. Craddock turned to her. You injected hartshorn, Mrs. Bantry. Salts, not cyanide. The hollow current already contained poison when you found it in the vestry. Miss Marple laid her knitting aside. Let us reconstruct. Thursday last, Miss Hartnell bought rat poison for church mice. Tin locked in the vestry. That night, someone carved 3 currants hollow. 1 for the fate scone, 1 for Miss Hartnell's coffee, 1 for Tommy's beer. The poison was added later, after baking through the glaze. She produced the torn prescription scrap from her handbag, the piece found in the colonel's rubbish. This is the bottom half. Patient, Mrs. A. Bantry. But the top half found in the vestry bin was addressed to Colonel R. Buthnot. You forged Dr. Haydock's pad, Colonel, to obtain cyanide for jackdaws. You tore the prescription in 2, burning your copy, leaving Dolores's to incriminate her. The Colonel's tremor worsened. Cuffs rattled. Rubbish. Yet the handwriting matches your regimental logs, Craddock said. We compared. Miss Marple continued. Friday dawn you visited the bakery. Mrs. Baker was distracted by the oven. You swapped 1 ordinary currant for your hollow one, dead center in the judge's scone. Mrs. Bantry glazed it unaware. At the fete, Mr. Polk took the plate by mistake. You watched him die, Mrs. Bantry gasped. Clarence, because of the silver? Regimental silver, Miss Marple said. Polk discovered you were melting it down to fund your nephew's flight from Nairobi. He demanded $500, you paid once, from Miss Hartnell's embezzled fund. When he asked again, you silenced him. Craddock held up the evidence bags, vial, glazing needle, burnt ledger. All found in your garden, Colonel. The Colonel's shoulders sagged. Boy saw too much. Tommy bragged at the Blue Boar. Had to be quick. Miss Marple's eyes were steady. You lured him to the bell tower with the forged note, poisoned his beer with the 3rd currant, carried the body up after midnight. Dr. Haydock's clock adjustment gave you 5 unaccounted minutes. Then you hanged him to look like suicide. Haydock's voice was hoarse. I advanced the clock. I enabled murder. You were deceived, Miss Marple said gently. The Colonel counted on your loyalty to an old patient. Mrs. Bantry stood trembling. And Miss Hartnell? Collateral, Craddock said. She discovered the missing $47.12.60. You tried to poison her coffee to keep the embezzlement quiet. When she survived, you burnt the ledger. The Colonel stared at the carpet. War took everything. Nepal, pension, honor, just needed a little longer. Miss Marple rose. Human nature, Colonel. The same in St. Mary Mead as in Mesopotamia. Greed wears many uniforms. Craddock signaled the constable. Take him away. As the Colonel was let out, Mrs. Bantry whispered, I nearly hanged for your crime. He did not look back. In the hall, Miss Hartnell waited, wrapped in a shawl. Ledger returned by the police. My brother's debts are paid, she said stiffly. The fund will be repaid. Thank you, Miss Marple. Miss Marple smiled. Observation, my dear, and a hollow current that rang like a bell. Dr. Haydock offered his arm as they stepped into the evening. The cedar on the green cast long shadows. The church clock struck 6, correctly now. Tea? Mrs. Bantry asked, voice steadier. Safe scones, I promise. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. With pleasure, though perhaps jam first. Chapter 7. The Delivery Boy's Secret. The Blue Boar cellar was colder than a tomb and twice as quiet. A single bulb swung from a beam, throwing shadows that danced like hanged men. Tommy Pierce lay on a trestle table beneath a horse blanket, his freckles stark against marble skin. Miss Marple stood at the foot, gloved hands folded, knitting needles still in her bag for once. Inspector Craddock and Dr. Haydock flanked her. Constable Polk guarded the stair. Cut down at 6, Craddock said, voice flat. Landlady found him. Rope still knotted. Sailor's work. Miss Marple lifted the blanket. Tommy's neck bore a livid ring, but the bruising was wrong. Too high, too even. His fingers clutched something, a hollow currant, wax plug intact, white powder visible inside. His secret, she murmured. He kept one back. Haydock's examination was swift. Cyanide in the stomach, swallowed, not injected. Beer dregs in the glass upstairs. He drank willingly, then was strung up. Dead before the rope touched him. Craddock bagged the current. Third one. Same batch. Miss Marple's eyes moved to Tommy's pocket. A crumpled note. Onion skin pencil blue bore cellar. Midnight. Bring the current. 5 or I tell. See, she said. Not the colonel, someone else. They climbed to the bar. Mrs. Burt, arms folded like hams, nodded to a corner table. Tommy sat there last night bragging. Said he'd seen summit worth a $5. A man in a dark coat bought him a half pint. Hat low, collar up. Tommy drank, laughed, then followed him down the cellar stair, never came up. Craddock's jaw tightened. Description? Couldn't see the face, but left-handed, paid with the left, coins clinking. Miss Marple's mind raced. Colonel Arbuthnot, left-handed but in custody since noon. Someone else. They searched Tommy's room above the post office, a narrow attic smelling of ink and apples. On the table, a child's diary locked. Miss Marple picked it with a hairpin, entries in smudged pencil. Aug 3. Saw call A take shiny bottle from doc's surgery, smelled funny. Aug 4, hollow current in vestry tin, white stuff inside, took one for luck. Aug 5, fate, Mr. P dead. Told Miss M call A did it, he gave me 2-6 to hush. Aug 6, man in dark coat at Blue Boar. Said bring current or tell police, 5ers met midnight. The final entry scrawled hastily. He's here, smells like almonds. Miss Marple closed the diary. Tommy tried amateur blackmail. The killer used his own method against him. Craddock's eyes narrowed. The man in the dark coat, who? Someone Tommy trusted enough to drink with, Miss Marple said. Someone who knew about the currents. They returned to the church. The vestry cupboard yielded another clue. A 4th hollow current hidden behind hymnals, wax plug missing. Powder gone. Insurance, Haydock said. The killer prepared extras. Miss Marple examined the cupboard lock, scratched, forced. Tommy's penknife. He stole the first current here. The killer followed his trail. Back at the Blue Boar, Mrs. Burt remembered. Tommy kept a box under the bar, tips and treasures. Might be Summit. The box, marbles, a shilling, a brass button, and a torn prescription scrap, top half. Pot, Cyan Gertu, Col L. Arbuthnot, the colonel's name. But the handwriting, Haydock's, yet the slant was wrong. Forged, Haydock said. Not my pen. Someone imitated me. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. The forger had access to your surgery and the colonel's rubbish bin. They confronted the colonel in the police station interview room. He sat cuffed to a chair, defiance crumbling. Tommy blackmailed me, he rasped. Saw the vial. I paid him to hush, but I never touched the boy. Craddock leaned in. Then who wrote the note? Who met him at midnight? The colonel's tremor stilled. Haydock. He came to my cottage at 11. Said he'd handle the boy. Gave me a sleeping draft. I woke at dawn. Clock advanced. Haydock's face drained. Lies. I was home. Miss Marple's voice cut through. Your microscope, doctor. The fingerprints on the clock key. Large, oily. Bell ringer's hands. You rang the tenor bell before the war. And the dark coat. Your old trench missing from the surgery peg. Haydock slumped. The colonel was selling silver. Pauk found out. I prescribed the cyanide for wasps, yes, but he stole it. When Tommy saw, I panicked. Lured him with the note. One current in his beer. Then the rope, to make it look like the colonel's work. Craddock snapped cuffs on Haydock's wrists. Motive? Debt, Haydock whispered. My wife's treatment. London specialists. The colonel paid me to keep quiet. When Pauk threatened exposure, he planned the scone. I finished the loose ends. Miss Marple's eyes were sad. You saved Miss Hartnell with emetics. Guilt? Haydock nodded. Too late for Tommy. Outside, the church clock struck 4, truthful now. The cedar's shadow stretched across the green like a benediction. Miss Marple walked home alone. In her cottage, she opened Tommy's diary to the final page and added in her neat copper plate, "Resolved." The delivery boy's secret was greed and trust, both deadly in St. Mary Mead. She closed the book, set it beside the completed baby bonnet, and began a new row of violets. Chapter 8. The Glaze of Deception. The police station interview room smelled of carbolic and despair. Dr. Haydock sat beneath a bare bulb, wrists cuffed, the trench coat folded on the table like a confession. Colonel Arbuthnot occupied the opposite chair, face carved from granite. Inspector Craddock stood between them, evidence bags lined up like soldiers, vial, glazing needle, hollow currents, one crushed, one sealed, one melted. Miss Marple entered last, closing the door with a soft click. She carried no knitting. Her hands were empty, eyes bright as winter stars. "Gentlemen," she began, "we have means and opportunity. Now for motive and the glaze that hid the truth." Craddock opened a folder. County lab report. Cyanide in all 3 currents. Injected post-baking through the honey glaze. Microscopic needle track sealed with beeswax. The scone intended for Mr. Polk was glazed after Mrs. Baker's oven by Mrs. Bantry, who believed it harmless. Mrs. Bantry, summoned from the hall, stood in the doorway, hat clutched like a shield. "I glazed it myself. The currant was already there, larger, darker. I thought it Greek." Miss Marple nodded. "It was hollowed before baking," Mrs. Baker confirmed. "But the poison entered later. Someone swapped the currant after the scone cooled." Haydock's voice was hoarse. "I saw the colonel at the stall 3:05 before judging. He hovered with a paper bag, said it was humbugs for the children." The colonel snorted. "Lies. I was at the Marrow tent." Craddock produced a photograph. The fete, time-stamped. The colonel's blazer, unmistakable near the cake stall. "Left hand in pocket," Miss Marple continued. "You carried the hollow currant in the bag, Colonel. Swapped it while Mrs. Bantry fetched change. The glaze needle, stolen from the hall still room, was in your other pocket. You injected the cyanide, sealed with wax from the hall hives, and returned the needle to the boiler ashes." The colonel's tremor returned. "Prove it." Craddock held up the needle. "Honey residue matches Gossington hives. Wax matches the seal on Tommy's currant. And your fingerprints, left thumb, on the vial cork." Haydock leaned forward. "But I lured Tommy. I poisoned his beer. Why frame me?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle steel. "You didn't frame him, Doctor. You finished what he began. The colonel poisoned Polk to silence the silver scandal. When Tommy blackmailed him, the colonel paid you $47.12.60 from Miss Hartnell's fund to eliminate the boy. You used the 3rd current, then hanged him to implicate the colonel's sailor knots." Haydock's shoulders sagged. "He promised the money would save my wife. When Polk demanded more, the colonel planned the scone. I was to destroy evidence, burn the ledger, poison Miss Hartnell, but Tommy. Tommy trusted you," Miss Marple said. "You bought him ginger beer every Saturday. He followed you to the cellar without fear." Mrs. Bantry's voice broke. "And Sir Henry?" "A red herring," Craddock said. "The special scone was bait. Polk took it by chance or was steered to it." Miss Marple produced the final clue, a glazed scone fragment from the fate rubbish preserved in a jar. "This is the real judge's scone, untouched." Mrs. Bantry set it aside. The poisoned one was swapped at the last moment. Observe the glaze, thicker on the fatal scone to hide the needle track. She placed the fragments side by side. The difference was subtle. Honey pooled thicker, darker, like a lie. Craddock turned to the colonel. Your nephew's cable from Nairobi. Intercepted. He confessed the forgery. You melted regimental silver to buy his silence. Polk found the crucible in your shed. The colonel stared at the floor. War hero, reduced to this, needed one last victory. Haydock whispered, I only wanted her to live. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Love and greed, twin currents in the same stream. The glaze deceived us all. Craddock closed the folder. Charges. Colonel Arbuthnot. Murder of Clarence Polk, conspiracy. Dr. Haydock. Murder of Thomas Pierce. Attempted murder of Emmeline Hartnell. As the men were led away, Mrs. Bantry touched Miss Marple's sleeve. Will I hang? For hartshorn? Miss Marple smiled. A fine, perhaps, and a new recipe book. Outside, the church clock struck 5, truthful, steady. The cedar's shadow stretched across the green like forgiveness. Miss Marple walked home through dusk. In her cottage, she opened Tommy's diary and added, The glaze hid the needle but not the heart. Resolved. She set the baby bonnet aside, began a scarf in soft blue, for a boy who would never grow up. Chapter 9. The Drawing Room Denouement. The drawing room at Gossington Hall had never looked so crowded nor so hushed. French windows stood open to the August dusk. Moths beat against the lamps like tiny ghosts. Every chair was taken. Mrs. Bantry on the sofa, rigid with dread. Miss Hartnell beside her, ledger clutched like a life-belt. Colonel Arbuthnot in cuffs by the fireplace, face carved from oak. Dr. Haydock opposite, trench coat folded, eyes hollow. Sir Henry Clithering, late of Scotland Yard, occupied the wing chair, marrow prize forgotten. Inspector Craddock stood at the door. Constable Polk guarded the hall. Miss Marple entered last, closing the double doors with a soft thud. She carried no knitting, only a small lacquered box. The room smelled of beeswax, tension, and the faint sweetness of honey. Shall we begin? She said, voice gentle as falling leaves. We have a death by poisoned scone, an attempted poisoning, and a boy hanged in a cellar, all connected by a hollow current and a glaze of deception. Let us lay the pieces end to end. She opened the box. Inside, on black velvet, 3 hollow currents, one intact, one crushed, one melted, the glazing needle, the torn prescription, the vile cork with its thumbprint. 4 currents were prepared, Miss Marple began. Carved hollow before baking, sealed with beeswax after. 3 held cyanide. The 4th, empty, was a decoy. Mrs. Bantry's voice trembled. I glazed the special scone. I thought the large currant was Greek. You did, Miss Marple said, but it was swapped at 3:05 while you fetched change. Colonel Arbuthnot hovered with a paper bag. Humbugs, he claimed. In truth, the poisoned currant. He injected the cyanide with this needle, stolen from your still room, then returned it to his boiler ashes. The colonel's cuffs rattled. Lies. Craddock held up the lab photograph. Thumbprint on the cork. Yours, Colonel. Left hand. Miss Marple continued. Motive. Regimental silver. You melted it down to fund your nephew's escape from Nairobi forgery charges. Mr. Polk discovered the crucible. He demanded $500. You paid once from Miss Hartnell's embezzled Belgian fund. When he asked again, you silenced him with the scone. Miss Hartnell gasped. 42 pounds, 12 shillings, 6 pence. My brother's debts. Exactly, Miss Marple said. You discovered the shortfall. The colonel tried to poison your coffee with the second current to keep you quiet. You survived. Thanks to Dr. Haydock's emetics. Haydock's head bowed. Guilt made me act. But the boy... Tommy Pierce, Miss Marple said softly. Saw the colonel take the vial from your surgery. He stole a hollow current from the vestry tin, planning mischief. He blackmailed the colonel for 2.6, then boasted at the Blue Boar. You, doctor, desperate to save your wife's treatment. offered $5 to silence him forever. You lured him to the cellar with a forged note, crushed the third current into his beer, then hanged him with sailor's knots to implicate the colonel. Haydock's voice cracked. He trusted me. I bought him ginger beer every Saturday. Sir Henry leaned forward. And the clock? Advanced 5 minutes at 2:45 a.m., Miss Marple said. Dr. Haydock obliged the colonel's request for a sunrise service. It gave the killer an alibi window. The church clock struck 11 while Tommy was already dead. Mrs. Bantry stood trembling. But my confession, hartshorn in the glaze to sicken Sir Henry for snubbing me. A red herring, Miss Marple said. You injected harmless salts into an empty current. The real poison was already there. She placed the decoy current, intact, wax-sealed, powder-free, beside the others. Found in the vestry by Tommy. He kept it as luck. The killer never noticed the fourth. Craddock snapped his notebook shut. Colonel Arbuthnot, murder of Clarence Polk, conspiracy to murder Emmeline Hartnell. Dr. Haydock, murder of Thomas Pierce, attempted murder of Miss Hartnell. Mrs. Bantry, wasting police time, minor charge. The colonel's defiance crumbled. War took everything, just needed time. Haydock whispered, her medicine. London. Miss Marple's eyes were sad. Time and medicine, both bought with blood. The glaze hid the needle, but not the heart. Sir Henry rose. Extraordinary, Miss Marple. A village fate, a scone, and 3 lives. Human nature, she replied. The same in St. Mary Mead as in Belgravia. Greed, fear, love, all glazed with honey. Craddock signaled the constable. As the men were led away, Mrs. Bantry touched Miss Marple's sleeve. Will I lose the hall? For hartshorn? Miss Marple smiled. A fine and a new still-room lock. Miss Hartnell opened her ledger. The Belgian fund, repaid by Michaelmas. Outside, the church clock struck 7, truthful, steady. The cedar shadow merged with night. Miss Marple walked home beneath stars. In her cottage, she opened Tommy's diary and wrote, Denouement. The glaze cracked. Truth is bitter but never hollow. She set the baby bonnet on the mantel, blue ribbon now tied, and began a tiny pair of boots. Chapter 10. Tea and Absolution. The vicarage garden had never seemed so peaceful. September sun slanted through the mulberry leaves, painting gold on the flagstones. A blackbird sang from the yew hedge. The scent of late roses drifted like forgiveness. At the wrought iron table, a fresh Victoria sponge waited beneath a glass dome. Mrs. Dane Calthrop's peace offering after a month of scones forever tainted. Miss Marple arrived first, carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. She wore dove-gray lace and the faint smile of a woman who has set the world to rights. Mrs. Dane Calthrop greeted her with a hug that smelled of flower and serenity. Jane, you're early. The others are coming at 4. Safe scones, I promise. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. With jam first, I hope. The gate creaked. Mrs. Bantry appeared, hat modest, cheeks flushed with something like hope. Behind her, Miss Hartnell marched in bottle green, ledger replaced by a checkbook. Sir Henry Clithering followed, offering his arm to Mrs. Price Ridley, who fanned herself with the church newsletter despite the breeze. Jane, Mrs. Bantry said, voice steadier, I've sold the London flat, the hall is safe, and Arthur, well, the land girl has gone to her aunt in Devon. Miss Hartnell thrust forward the checkbook. Belgian fund restored, 4712.60 plus interest. My brother's debts are paid. I've taken a post at the county library. No more ledgers. Sir Henry chuckled. And I've judged my last marrow. From now on, only roses. Tea was poured. Lapsang sochong, no raisins in sight. The sponge was cut, jam and cream circulated. Conversation tiptoed at first, then flowed. Mrs. Price Ridley leaned forward. The trial, October assizes. The colonel confessed everything. Dr. Haydock, too, said he only wanted to save his wife. Mrs. Dane Calthrop's serene eyes misted. She died last week peacefully in her sleep. He asked the prison chaplain to read the Psalms. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Guilt is a heavy glaze. It cracks eventually. Mrs. Bantry buttered a second slice. And Tommy's mother. She's moving to her sister in Bristol. I've set up a trust. Post office scholarship for clever boys who deliver more than letters. Miss Hartnell nodded. I've added 10 for booties. She glanced at the parcel in Miss Marple's lap. Speaking of which, Miss Marple unwrapped it, the premature baby's bonnet now joined by tiny boots in soft blue wool. For the Belgian fund raffle, though I fear they'll fetch more than scones. Sir Henry raised his cup. To Miss Marple, who saw through honey to the heart. Glasses clinked, teacups in St. Mary mead. Laughter rose, light as sponge. Later, as shadows lengthened, Miss Marple walked Mrs. Bantry to the gate. Dolores, the still room lock? New Yale, and cook has sworn off currants. Miss Hartnell lingered by the roses. Jane, I was wrong about human nature. You showed me kindness can be sharper than suspicion. Miss Marple smiled. Observation, my dear, and a little faith. At dusk, she returned to her cottage. The cedar on the green stood sentinel. The church clock struck 6, truthful, steady. Inside, Tommy's diary lay open on the desk. She added one final line, resolution. Grief passes. Jam first, always. The village knits on. She set the diary beside the wireless, tuned to a gentle concerto, and began a new shawl. Lavender with a border of blackberry stitch. Outside, children chased hoops across the green, their laughter bright as bunting.